Hello everyone, my name is Jacob Berman, the host of this channel, The History Valley. Welcome in. I am joined by Abu. He appeared on this channel a while back, actually back on the old channel where I used to upload these videos years back. And I'm joined by James Valliant, author of Creating Christ. So we got some things to talk about. So first off, I'll just start off by saying asking how you doing.
I'm great. How are you guys doing?
I'm doing good. And he's doing just fine. Yeah. So the thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the Egyptian and James. So last time we talked about this, we went through the chronological reasons why James and the Egyptian have to be the same person. This time we're going to go into further evidence that confirms that they are the same person. So first off, I'm going to bring up the Talmud, which is, it's not primary evidence, but it is based, the Talmud has derived its information from the primary evidence. And it mentions that there was a brother of Yeshua ben Pandira called Yaakov ben Pandira, or Jacob ben Pandira. And he was spreading teachings from Egypt and sorcery, just like what's going on, and with the story of Ben Pandira and Yeshua ben Pariah. Yeshua ben Pariah was the tutor of Judah ben Tabai and Yeshua ben Pandira and the Talmud. Now later on, we're going to go into how they created these characters and that their chronology has been messed up, but that's a separate video. However, it's the Jacob Pandira is the person we're going to be looking at in the Talmud, because he's based on James the Just. And 2 paragraphs, I'm going to show all this on the screen as I'm talking. James the Just was executed 2 paragraphs after Josephus mentioned that there was a imitator that rebelled against Porcius Festus, or Porcius Festus. I think it's pronounced Porcius Festus.
In correct Latin, C's and G's, people don't ever do it. We call it Caesar, but obviously Kaiser. C's and G's are hard in original Latin. And our English versions call him Caesar. You know, it's fun. Isn't that funky? It's always a Caesar salad. But in Caesar's time, it'd be Kaiser. And so it's Porcius, and it literally, his ancestors were pig keepers. He comes from the same family as the Catos, Porcius Cato. But most people call it Porcius. And in fact, the character of Cato's daughter in, say, Shakespeare is always Portia. So pronunciations, the English have butchered Latin for quite some time.
So it looks to me that, because here's the thing, Josephus says that this guy was executed. He was killed at the battlefield. 2 paragraphs before the death of James. And James, Josephus doesn't hardly tell us anything about him. The reason why he's killed isn't stated either. It doesn't make any sense. It just shows up arbitrarily in antiquities.
Why inexplicable? And because it seems to me that it's clear that James is a ideologue of the rebel faction, and Josephus is keen to whitewash him. Therefore, he has to disassociate him from his actual associations in history. That's clear. Josephus is trying to realizes his popularity. That's plain from the text, and is therefore trying to absorb and adopt sort of the popularity for his own purposes.
Absolutely.
And the story shows mismanagement on the part of which is very interesting, on the priestly establishment, the leadership that was supported by Rome, their poor management of the unstable situation in Judea. He notes that it was between governors, that implying that Roman governors would have been more sensitive, politically sensitive, to the outright or immediate execution of James, whatever his connection to the rebellion was. But there seems, in my mind, little doubt that James was a rebel ideologue of the zealot kind, of the Judas the Galilean type. But that is something Josephus dare not tell us, since he wanted to whitewash him and make him sort of absorb his popularity.
Now, it says here, so here's what we're going to be taking a look at. Porcius Festus, he reigned as the governor from about 59 to 62 AD. If you remember, in 62 AD, Governor Albinus was on his way to become governor of Judea, so that's how we know it's referring to that specific date. And it says here, Festus sent forces, both horsemen and footmen, to fall upon those that had been seduced by a certain impostor who promised them deliverance and freedom from the miseries they were under, if they would but follow him as far as the wilderness. Accordingly, those forces that were sent destroyed both him that had deluded them and those that were his followers also. Now, just before that, Josephus mentioned the Egyptian false prophet. And he says, there was an Egyptian false prophet that did the Jews more mischief than the former, for he was a cheat and pretended to be a prophet also, and got together 30,000 men that were deluded by him. These he led round about from the wilderness to the mount which they called the Mount of Olives. He was ready to break into Jerusalem by force from that place, and if he could but once conquer the Roman garrison and the people, he intended to rule them by the assistance of those guards of his that were to break into the city with him.
Wow.
So it sounds like he's describing the same person.
Key words: imposter, deluded, wilderness.
Common.
We're talking about rebel leaders who are claiming to be prophets or indeed the Messiah themselves.
It looks like he's describing the same person here. The Egyptian's death is never mentioned, but the imposter does die. So does James. So the thing about this is that
it's a period of intense rebel activity right before this happens.
Exactly. Now here's where the gaps fill in.
Yeah.
Because James was killed at the same time that the impostor was, and because Josephus doesn't tell us who he was, that is the impostor, he won't tell us the name, and because James dies at the same time, and Origen of Alexandria tells us his copy of Josephus says that the death of James caused a great stir in Judea. Because of those reasons, the conclusion I come to is that they're the same person.
Right.
And that what happened is that Ananias was part of the Roman army that was coming he was with them at least, that was coming to capture this guy. But he has him killed anyway, and around that same time, Porcius Festus died, and he's waiting on Governor Albinus to come in to give him new orders, but he kills the guy anyway, in between governors to take advantage of the situation. This is happening on 62 AD. That's the conclusion I come to, because that's the best explanation that I have that explains all of this.
It's very tempting to say that James is one of these very rebel leaders, if not the unnamed rebel leader that is both of them, if they are the same person.
Right.
It happens at the same time. Now, there's a couple of things to note. One is, it could be that he was an ideological. There does seem to be a double leadership issue within the Dead Sea Scrolls community, for example. They expected both a kingly and a priestly Messiah.
Right.
When the rebel movement, the fourth philosophy, the innovator, as Josephus puts it, the ultra-conservative Judas the Galilean starts his movement, the Zealot movement, the rebel movement. He has a partner called Zadok. the righteous one. And so there appears to be a sort of ideological priestly leader as well as a political kingly leader in that leadership situation as well. Both the rebellion, the Zealot movement, and the DSS, the Dead Sea Scrolls movement, appear to dovetail in this regard. And so it could be that figures like John the Baptist and James the Just were clearly being whitewashed by Josephus. It may be that it's possible for Josephus to whitewash them precisely because they weren't actual violent rebel leaders, but rather ideological leaders, and out baptizing and preaching rather than collecting an army and attacking, like our unnamed imposter is from the Mount of Olives.
Right.
The fact that this guy goes unnamed is ultra suspicious, though. Ultra suspicious. It could be that it's the very next person he's going to talk about that he wants to whitewash and he wants to dissociate them. Or it could be that this person has a messianically suspicious identity, a Jesus, a Christ, a Messiah, that he doesn't want to so name. Just call him an imposter. From his perspective, this is a false Messiah of the kind that Jesus warned about in his famous prophecy in Mark 13. Beware of these false messiahs.
This is also why in Acts, Paul is pursuing the Egyptian when he is captured and confused for him by Claudius Lysias. Now, Claudius Lysias is the same person as Felix, Governor Felix. Remember, Felix's full name is Claudius Felix.
Claudius Felix was the brother to one of the most important and powerful men in the world. One of the Emperor Claudius's, and then at the beginning of Nero's reign, one of Nero's most important ministers of state. It would be like, the White House chief of staff today, or the Secretary of State, or the Secretary of, literally freedmen, like this guy who was the brother of Felix, were.
By the way, slight correction: Claudius Antonius Felix.
And that
Marcus Antonius Felix Claudius.
That makes really good sense. Claudius's mother Antonia, right? So a freedman of Claudius would have the name Claudius.
Right.
Take the last name Claudius. Now that he has a Roman name, he's a free Roman citizen. They typically take the name of their previous owner. Just as in the American South, by the way, slaves took the names of their owners in many cases. So it was tradition for Roman slaves, freedmen, to do so. So, Claudius Felix is an important freedman of the Emperor Claudius. Freed slaves could be trusted, you see, by the emperor even more than these aristocratic senators.
Right.
And senators came to resent this group of people, by the way. But having the name Claudius, it does seem to indicate a freedman of Claudius, the Emperor Claudius. That much is true. And an important freedman of Claudius.
Yeah, so it looks to me that Paul in the Egyptian thing in Acts is very similar to the spying out of Paul's freedom in Christ discussed in Galatians.
Oh, this is fast.
James and Paul.
Paul was persecuted. We have this great tradition of Paul persecuting Christians. And then, even after he joins the Christians, his big disagreement with the leadership, James and Kephas.
Yeah, and they weren't really Christians.
Going after the Egyptian
they were Jews.
Is just pregnant, isn't it?
Yeah,
it tells us the Egyptian movement is, in effect, the movement that Paul is persecuting and infiltrating.
And recently I talked about that the Habakkuk Pesher was redacted. About 10 columns of the text was added into what became the Habakkuk Pesher. And it talks about the rock, and Paul is responding to Kephas, or Cephas, the rock, in Galatians. It's the same person. Cephas was the redactor. He is this person calling himself Habakkuk. And he's attacking the liar and the wicked priest for what they had done to James, or the teacher of righteousness. Of course, James is being compared to the teacher of righteousness, the one that was 2 centuries earlier.
See, that's it. Isn't it? With all due respect, and you know how much I respect Professor Eisenman, and I believe Professor Eisenman does demonstrate that Paul is keying off of the language, the ideology, the literature of the Dead
Right.
Sea Scrolls sectarian movement. There's no question. Eisenman
Absolutely.
demonstrates that to me. However, I think when you read most of the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian documents, it's clear that at least they're mostly about earlier events concerning their founder in the 2nd century BC, sometimes about events like the coming of the Romans in the 1st century BC. Now, some of it seems to, it does occasionally seem to refer to the 1st century of the Common Era, but let's face it, when
Most
you read
of it doesn't.
it appears to be about the founder in the 2nd century BC,
Yeah.
and some of it the 1st century BC.
Just like
That's just my opinion.
back at like 12 a.m. today,
Yeah.
I did a show on a Jeremiah apocryphon, or the apocryphon of Jeremiah, and it clearly is referring to events that are happening in the 1st century BCE and 2nd century BCE, written in multiple fragments. It looks like it was authored by multiple people, because it's in multiple fragments.
Your thesis, your documentary hypothesis about the second documents. Are you okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Your really interesting hypothesis about a documentary hypothesis, a documentary development of multiple authors, such as we've had for a long time in Christian scholarship, applied to the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian documents, I think is a really, really interesting one. Because clearly many of these documents do seem to have been, let's put it this way, gone over and over by subsequent authors with additions and whatnot.
Yeah. And that happened with Hosea Pesher, and that happened with Habakkuk Pesher. But there's also another text that appears to be solely written in the 1st century CE called A Lament for Zion, talking about...
But if they talk about the coming of a whole new group of Kittim for the first time...
Yeah, that's earlier. 1st century BCE.
Pompeius Magnus.
It couldn't be dated any other time other than 63 BCE.
In the 60s BC, which is more credibly the time to date such a document, because that's the event it's concerned with. But if they're also talking about the final defeat of the Seleucids, well, then we're talking about the 120s BC.
Mm-hmm.
And let's face it,
128.
If those are the events that we can identify as being referenced, then let's face it, that's what the document is talking about.
Exactly.
Now, it could be talking about it in light of later events in some bits and fragments. There could be bits and fragments that do mention it. Gosh knows, we know that these documents were important to the rebels.
Right.
They tried to preserve them in 70. That's why we have them preserved in those caves around the Dead Sea, because they were preserved so carefully by people around 70. That is to say, the rebel leadership felt these important documents, and that cannot be ignored.
Right.
These are the movements these are the rebel movements' ideological documents.
Definitely.
But they mostly talk about events 200 years or something, or 100 years earlier, events of their founding in the 2nd century BC and the 1st century BC.
Agreed.
Come on. I think with all due respect to our friend Mr. Lawson, who I like a great deal, I don't think that the 40 years can be placed in the 1st century.
Right, like I showed earlier, the 40 years occurs after the teacher's death, and the 390 years plus the 20 years of wilderness adds up to 410 years. 410 years after the temple was destroyed on 586 BCE, lands on the date 176 BCE, which was when Yeshua, the last Zadokite high priest, which is exactly how the teacher of righteousness is portrayed, the last Zadokite high priest, he becomes high priest on that date. That's not a coincidence.
It's the founding of the movement. They're dating there, and you've convinced me. I think that's a very firm kind of argument too. You've convinced me what it's doing is dating the founding of the movement.
Yeah. Because the simplest answer is
the entire Essene movement.
Yeshua the Zadokite, also known as Jason, poorly translated as Jason, is the teacher of righteousness.
Right.
That's him.
You've certainly found exactly dated the founding of the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian movement. It could even be, to my way of thinking, the founding of the entire Essene school of Roman period Judaism.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to show up any earlier than that. Anyway.
Right. And it seems to be And the sectarian documents of the scrolls seem to be defining at least one group. We have ancient documents which divide the Essenes into different forms and groups, but it could be that this is the beginning of all of them. And from all the Essenes originally splintered.
It wouldn't shock me at all.
Right. And it could be that our Jason, a Yeshua, our original, probably a Yeshua, Jason, the founder of this movement, could well be the Jesus that people like James and Kephas are having visions of, not
right.
Paul.
I'm pretty certain of it. That's the guy they're having visions of.
Yeah. See, there's no reason to hypothesize that the pre-Paul Jesus that Paul describes the various visions of the risen Jesus, and James, the 12, Kephas, and then finally me, untimely born.
That's why
all those previous guys' visions may be just about this founder of their movement.
Yeah, but that's why in Galatians 3, they say that Jesus wasn't crucified. That's because Paul did not believe in the same Jesus that was crucified by Pilate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's easy. See, the thing is that it's easy to see why the confusion could be created too, because the movement itself is going to compare their leaders to the founder and to each other. They're going to pressure the hell out of the lives of their teachers of righteousness, aren't they? They're going to say this guy is like our founder, this guy is like our founder, and there could even be a movement, that reincarnation thought. I mean, within the New Testament, we hear people saying, "Are you, to John the Baptist," or about, "Are you Elijah?"
Right.
Wow, were there people who really expected Elijah?
It's the idea of reincarnation. Old Testament prophets coming back into the first century CE. That's exactly what it is. And Paul was arguing. This is what he was arguing: the teacher of righteousness reincarnated as a Roman clan king. And who's he talking about? Well, he's talking about Judaized King Banus. That's why his vision happens in 31 AD. As I've proven that multiple times. It's so easy to prove it.
Our Paul is developing a Christology that is unusual, isn't it?
Exactly.
Because he believes in a Davidic king. He believes in He believes in the Messiah becoming flesh here on earth in that sense. But it's divinity. It's a real Jewish king, like the Hasmoneans, might be high priests, but they would not be gods. They might be messiahs like Judas Maccabeus, their founder, but they're not gods, for gosh sake. There might be miraculous events like the Hanukkah miracles, but they're not gods, for gosh sakes.
Exactly.
And Paul is believing in a very Hellenized, divine Messiah king. And he seems to be tailoring it for a first century Hellenized Jewish, and your client kings really are the ones who fit the bill. Those kings at Antioch, right? They converted to Judaism. They would have this Messiah king ideology associated,
they fit perfectly,
and yet they are worshipped as gods.
Yep.
So, and they're highly Hellenized in their thinking.
They are. They absolutely are. And that's when Ananias started his anti-circumcision preaching at Antioch.
We know Ananias started his anti-circumcision teaching there. And can it be an accident that Paul, who spends so much of his writings arguing against circumcision,
indeed,
and Acts tells us he studied from and was healed by a guy of similar name from, quote, Damascus.
Yeah.
Is any of that a coincidence? It's hard to that's coincidence.
There's really no way around it. Well, I think that
what we've got is really Ananian Christianity. People call it Pauline Christianity,
I think it was called Yedism or Yedidism.
Yeah, but
Yedidism is the following of Philo's Judaism. Yedidism. Because Philo in Hebrew is Yedidia. Friend of God. The friends of God. That's pretty much what they were.
Right. Wasn't Philo developing a Hellenized, Roman-friendly form of Judaism?
I mean, we know that his nephew was responsible for crucifying James and Simon. That was Tiberius Alexander on AD 47.
Was governor of Judea in the 40s under Claudius, right when all this activity is happening. He would also go on to be governor of Egypt during the Jewish War, and then he would then with he was right at Titus's side at the siege of Jerusalem. Tiberius Alexander, the nephew of Philo, was there at Titus's side at the siege of Jerusalem.
Bingo, that's it. That's how it all fits in.
And he's a funny thing is he was a governor of both. Now, mind you, a man of Jewish extraction,
right?
Both governor of Judea and Egypt under the Romans. Now, Josephus tells us he lost his faith somewhere along the line, but that's if we're coming from Josephus, that's kind of ironic.
There's something funny about that because he is taught by the guy that murdered James, and he calls him Banus, but Ananias Ben Ananias. That's what it is. Banus is Ben Hanan, so that's who that guy was, and it looks like he was sort of at least from a quasi status. He was already leaning towards that direction.
Yeah. See, his argument, Eisenman argues, Damascus is like code. It could be code for the wilderness. It could be code for Adiabel. It could be code, right? And so when we talk about Josephus talks about 3 suspicious years in the wilderness with a Banus, he himself, as Josephus admits himself in his autobiography, he always had the same anti-circumcision attitude, he claims, at least, that Paul and Ananias had.
There you go.
So your hypothesis is tempting, that in Josephus we have yet another student of the anti-circumcision Ananias guy.
That's the same movement.
We know Ananias was teaching anti-circumcision at Adiabene before Paul and Josephus, and Paul and Josephus adopt that position later on.
Exactly. Well, I think that just about covers it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we made a point, at least.
Yeah. Well, everyone, thanks for watching, and if any of you have any questions, throw it in the comment section. I'll do the very best I can to answer them to the best of my ability, and hopefully it satisfies. And if any of you want to go further to support this channel, check out Patreon, PayPal, or Super Chat in a live video in the future. Thank you, and I'll see all of you later. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video. I just want to let all of you know there's going to be a new video coming out soon called The Egyptian False Prophet, Who He Really Is. In that video specifically, I will reveal that it was actually Kephas, whom later becomes Peter. He's actually the one that went to the Mount of Olives, and he was the one that was called the Egyptian by Josephus. But this does not contradict the videos in which I said James is the Egyptian. As I've discussed in this video already, the Talmud addressed James as Jacob Panfer, or Yaakov ben Panthera, or Panthera. He is also referred to as an Egyptian. And then after that, we're going to be doing another video called Rescuing Paul's Epistles, which will indicate that Pope Clement I destroyed the original Pauline corpus, and then he rewrote them. Or I should say he rewrote them, then he destroyed the epistles, because that would make better sense. That's what happened. I'll discuss the evidence that indicates that that's exactly what happened, and then I will go from there. I look forward to getting those videos out there. Thanks for watching again, and I'll see all of you later.